Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and happy first day of fall. This is John Toscano, and I co-lead Bloom's education practice. Thank you all for joining us today for the first in a series of 3 webinars we've planned specifically for school business officers. And of course, we all hope your campus reopenings are moving along as planned. We're very proud to provide guidance to about 70 independent schools through a diverse set of service offerings focused on the needs of private schools. And as we work with our clients, this year especially, and other institutions, the workplace has definitely transformed. They say necessity is the mother of invention, and in this case, the pandemic has definitely helped speed up the change. So with that, new risks emerge and others get heightened. And today's speakers, Jeff Ziplow and Christine DeMena, will lead us through this transformation and leave us with some things to think about. Before Jeff and Christine take over the commentary here, I think we might have just some administrative housekeeping to communicate to everybody. So we'll do that, and then on to Jeff and Christine.
Perfect. Good morning, and thank you again for joining us for today's webinar, Managing Teleworking and Enterprise Risk for Independent Schools. We will be getting started shortly, but first I wanted to take a couple of minutes to go over the format of today's webinar. All microphones have been placed on mute for the duration of this webinar. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please use the Questions tab in the menu. We will address questions at the end of the webinar as time permits. Any questions we don't get to on this webinar will be sent to the presentators to follow up on. We're also recording this session, and the recording will be sent over after this webinar. If you are attending the webinar for the CPE credit, you will need to complete all 3 polling questions presented during the webinar, along with completing the follow-up survey that will be emailed out tomorrow morning. And now I will turn it back over to John Toscano to introduce our presenters, Christine and Jeff.
Thanks. If you can just advance the slide, we'll see some lovely pictures of Jeff Ziplow and Christine DeMena, both with our business advisory group. And they're going to take over the discussion now and walk us through remote workplace environments, as well as enterprise risk management and what that's all mean to all of us over the last several months. So take it away, Jeff and Christine.
Thank you, John. This is Jeff Ziplow, and what I wanted to do is really talk about this whole aspect of, telecommunicating, as well as, enterprise risk and what we need to start thinking about. I put this comment out here: telecommuting will likely continue long after the pandemic. I actually very much believe in this comment. I think that we've learned a lot. We were all forced into a very uncomfortable, somewhat awkward situation as the result of the pandemic. And now I think we've realized that we can actually survive and move forward in the world of telecommuting. We have a number of independent schools that have gone back, on site. We have other independent schools that are, I'll call it a hybrid model, some on site, some virtual. And then we have others that are doing, virtual. And I think what we're going to see for the future, in my mind, is ongoing telecommuting with many of our employees. And so it's here to stay. We just need to make it secure. We need to identify what those risks are and how we can better and effectively mitigate risks within our respective organizations. Next slide, please. So, as I was mentioning earlier, the pandemic really forced many businesses to think differently and to implement very quickly a teleworking environment. And we now need to really take a step back and look at what those hidden risks are, and how we can mitigate those risks over time. And then I think also how it impacts our overall enterprise risk as it relates to, our independent school. And what I'm hoping to at least draw out through this webinar is identification of the risks about working at home and reimagining how we can do it effectively and securely. Certainly address areas of concern that we're seeing as it relates to working at home. Then offer some insights as far as best practices. And then lastly, really get into and talk about enterprise risk management and really understand how we can use ERM as a way to guide us in the future, and really start thinking about risks. And we bring this up because no one ever predicted, or I shouldn't say no one, but the prediction of this pandemic was not globally thought about. And now that we've seen it, we've seen how it works, we've seen the impact, I think we need to start thinking about and looking at how ERM, enterprise risk management, can get us to think a little bit differently and really expand our thought process about implications and impacts to our respective organizations. So let me turn to the next slide, which is some cyber facts, if you will. One of the things that we are seeing, and I'll probably get into I will get into more details about ransomware, but ransomware is impacting many organizations, and really what we're seeing here is that every 30 seconds there's some type of hacker attack, mostly phishing, but it's occurring on a more regular basis. 43% of the cyber attacks are targeting small businesses, but we're also seeing a lot of attacks on schools, and one of the reasons for that is because you have a lot of really valuable information. You have a lot of information on your students, health information, you have a lot of social security information and the like. That information people want, or I should say the attackers want. And so we need to protect ourselves, regarding that. And then, many times I get asked the question, well, has COVID really had an impact on, cybersecurity and cyber crimes? And the answer is absolutely yes. A 300% increase in the reported cyber crimes. And one of the reasons that we're seeing this 300% increase, if you will, is now that we've implemented teleworking, we've expanded the framework, we've expanded the access points to an independent schools network. We're able to do it now. We were able to protect the border, if you will, within the school. But now our border has morphed into the teleworkers' home office, and we need to protect that home office. And we'll certainly talk about items in there as to how to protect it. The next slide shows, some other cyber fun facts, if you will. So what we're seeing is many of the cybersecurity breaches are really a result of human error. And this human error is people responding to phishing emails and providing credentials, and certainly not done intentionally, but those hackers out there are making it look like you're being reached out to by a member of your trusted community. And I want to use the word trust there very specifically because we tend to be very trusting people, and what we need to do is start thinking a little bit differently. We need to think about a cybersecurity incident response plan, because I'm sure you've heard the adjective, it's not if, it's when. So we need to think about that when component, and having a documented cybersecurity incident response plan is going to be really, really important. You don't want to be creating the plan when when or if you have a ransomware attack. You want to know what that plan looks like, and you want to be able to implement and execute that plan relatively quickly. Many companies don't realize this, but data breaches, occur over a period of time. And so there's a period of time, and I would say the average is 6 months to detect an actual data breach. So you have people sitting in your infrastructure, in your network, in your data for typically on average, 6 months. And then the last point here is this thing called IoT devices. IoT stands for Internet of Things, and we have those Internet of Things in our Ring cameras, in our cars. We have it in washing machines. We have it in ovens at home. We just need to be really careful about the Internet of Things, because as much as we want to think that they're secure, they're not, or they may not be secure out of the box. And given the fact that in 2020, we're going to have 31 billion devices out there, IoT devices, we need to really think about how and where those IoT devices are and how they're being secure. So on the next slide, I want to talk about ransomware, because ransomware has changed significantly over the past 2, maybe 3 years. So if you know, ransomware in the past has been we somehow download or get a piece of software downloaded to our computer, and it encrypts our computer, and then all the data that's associated or that we have access to, and we have to pay a ransom, and we would have to pay a ransom in Bitcoin. Well, the reality in today's world is this ransomware program, if you will, or process has changed. What's happening, or what has happened, is the attackers have gotten smart. They're actually using the ransomware software to gain access into your network, exfiltrate critical and key information. And so they're going to be putting it out there, on the web, in very specific areas on the web that only the attackers have access to. The dark web is what it's known as. And then what happens is, then they go about encrypting your data. And then you have to pay a ransom. So in some ways, it's double dipping. They're typically actually downloading or extracting information from the systems that are out there, and then they're putting it out on the dark web, and then they're asking for a ransom to encrypt your information. In some instances, they're asking for an even bigger ransom to take or remove the information that they exfiltrated from the dark web and destroy it, if you will. A really good instance of this, and some of you may have heard about it, some of you may have received letters from, but recently there was a Blackbaud breach. And in particular, Razor's Edge, the donor management software, had been attacked through Blackbaud's, software as a service environment, and they had a ransomware attack. Many organizations, even big organizations, were impacted. Planned Parenthood, the George W. Bush Presidential Center, Vermont Public Radio, Rhode Island School of Design, and many others. And certainly not trying to put anyone on the spot on this call today, but Blackbaud began telling users that they had a breach on July 16th. However, and here's where there's some misunderstanding or some concerns, the user community found out that the attack actually happened on February 7th and went undetected until May 14th, I believe. And then going one step further, the users were not notified until July. And so that's my point about the attackers are going in, they're spending some time, they're looking around, they're exfiltrating information, and now, after the fact, when they get caught, now we have the ransomware component. What Blackbaud has said is that credit card information, bank account information, or social security numbers were not stolen. That's what we've been told. I don't know any more than you do, but I am certainly concerned about that. Blackbaud, did pay a ransom through Bitcoin, and they were hoping that by paying the ransom, the attackers would destroy the breached information. I can tell you that in the recent past couple months, we've had many clients reach out to us and ask about this attack in particular, and what one needs to do, and what are the next steps for the independent schools. We can certainly have a conversation on another day, but that needs to be addressed by any schools that were impacted, or, to be quite frank, any organizations that were impacted, because you may need to reach out to the Attorney General's office and provide some information to them. Well, that's for a later description, or probably a later webinar. What I'd like to do now is move on to life and work separation. And our next slide really talks about under life and work separation. Oh, I guess we have a poll question. I'm sorry.
Sorry, Jeff.
No problem.
We're going to get into our first poll question, which is, what % of your organization's employees are currently working remotely?
Are we good?
We are.
Awesome. So if you wouldn't mind moving forward to the next slide from there. Yep. So life work separation, and this really starts talking about the teleworker. Couple of things to think about. If I'm a teleworker, hopefully the teleworkers that you have in place are not using home PCs. Hopefully we've been able to provide them with PCs from the respective independent school. And the reason for that is many home computers haven't been implemented with appropriate levels of security. So virus protection software, many times, and I've seen even with friends and others, that virus protection software either doesn't exist or does exist but hasn't been updated in years. Home PC may already be infected and we might not know about it, as well as a lot of times home PCs are not fully patched with the operating systems. And so I really strongly believe, if at all possible, we want to make sure that the teleworker has a computer that has been appropriately secured by the independent school that they're using at home. And I guess that leads us into the next discussion, which is, we shouldn't allow anyone, the teleworker, no, go back if you don't mind. We should not allow the teleworker to use their PC or let others use their PC other than for, specific office work. We don't want to inadvertently download any software. We don't want anyone to inadvertently respond to emails if they're not, the actual user, if you will, of that computer. And then lastly, the point here is, do not, under any circumstances, store school or student information on a remote PC. All information should be maintained on the school's network or in the appropriate cloud. Storing information on a remote PC only causes a lot of agita, and to be quite frank, it's just not an appropriate area to store that type of information. So moving on to the next slide, we also need to be cognizant of our home internet security, right? Many of us, if we're teleworking, we have our own network in our house that we need to secure. And so we need to make sure that we've changed the standard user IDs and passwords on the firewall that was provided to us by either a cable company or by whomever our cable company is, and really help to ensure that we put in the appropriate security settings on the firewall. If you're using Wi-Fi, make sure that there's a password on your Wi-Fi, and consider only allowing selected devices to connect up to your Wi-Fi. And I know, for example, I use Xfinity, and I've set up, a network using their security protocols. And one of the things it does allow me to do is it allows me to limit who can access my Wi-Fi network, and it provides me an alert to identify that a device wants to access my network. And be careful as to who you're allowing on your network. And if at all possible, don't allow people to go onto your network. So moving on to the next slide, which is really patching employees and setting up an environment for your employees. So I look at your employees, they're the greatest defense of security. They can also be your biggest liability. And so your employees really are your first line of defense. And the more they know about security protocols that they need to be thinking about, the better off we are. They can escalate issues and problems quickly. If something doesn't smell right, our employees should be there to reach out to the internal IT folks and say something's going on or this doesn't smell right, and be able to get help immediately. And sharing and having some type of ongoing periodic awareness training, security awareness training is really, really important. And that includes phishing our employees. And so if you go to the next slide, I do believe that it is a good practice to phish our employees in a simulated phishing environment. It gets them to think a little bit differently. Hopefully they'll get into the mindset of stop, think, and then react when they're seeing some type of phishing email. And those things are really, really important to help enhance their awareness of a security incident or situation taking place, and they can share that information with others within their user community as well as with IT. And phishing your employees, I always think is a great idea and something that I certainly strongly recommend. So let's move on to passwords. And the next slide, is actually, believe it or not, it was actually at a client site. And again, one of the things I want to remind you is, even though you're at home teleworking, it's never a good idea of putting your passwords on your screen or on your keyboard. Or yes, I've seen it many times before. And we do this frequently when we go around looking at people's computers, typically on site in an office, underneath their keyboard is typically where you're going to find, the passwords written. Please don't do this, because inevitably a family member or someone could come into your office and see these passwords and inadvertently, either respond to something or inadvertently give out password information that shouldn't exist anywhere but in your head or in some type of security password tool. Moving on to the next slide, passwords are important, and I thought it was a good idea to show you that there are password crackers out there, and if you have a 6-character password, it can be cracked in 12 seconds, and you can see the list here, 7 characters, 5 minutes, 8 characters, 4 hours. Look what happens when you get into the 12 characters. So certainly here, the longer the password, and I will tell you, I always recommend a minimum of 10. I would love to see people to implement 12 characters for all their passwords, because at that point, as you can see, you don't have to really worry about it being cracked. I think that if we're looking at 7.5 million years, we're in pretty good shape. I also certainly recommend passphrases. Do not use dictionary terms or anything that you would find in a dictionary. Use some passphrases that you're comfortable with. I like the New England Patriots. This gives me a combination of upper and lowercase characters. And as you can see, special characters at the end. And I know what my special phrases are. And by the way, I don't use this exact one, so don't worry about that. But I think it really is important for us from a good cyber hygiene perspective to think about passwords differently. The longer the better. Passphrases are equally important. On the next slide, where we get into this thing called the virtual private network. So if I'm teleworking at home, I'm hoping that all the private schools out there have implemented a virtual private network. And you may have heard it as a VPN. And what that VPN does is it actually looks like it's creating a secure tunnel between my home office and the private school. And that tunnel is encrypted, and that tunnel doesn't allow for people to crack into and sniff information. Again, it's a very secure way of sharing information and allowing us to pass information back and forth between my home office and the private school. And to add another flavor to it, you'll see on the next slide that if I am going to use a VPN, a virtual private network, I absolutely want to implement multi-factor authentication. And you've probably heard about multi-factor authentication. It's something you know and something you have. So something I know is typically a user ID and password. Something I have is actually my cell phone. It could be that RSA fob that is generating a number randomly. But what I think we should be doing and implementing, excuse me, for VPN access, as well as for access to any cloud solutions, if available, implement multi-factor authentication so that there is a confirmation either through a phone call, a text message, and you can see here, where you see the approve sign in, I can verify or I can add, type in the number that you see there. But in either case, it's validating. It's something that I have that verifies I am the requester, and I want to create a secure environment. Multi-factor authentication will help enhance security to be quite frank, by 150%. It's a great tool to have. It's a great tool to implement. Some people will say or suggest that it's just an added step. And I guess what I would say is it's an important added step that you do absolutely want to integrate into your security program wherever and whenever possible. On the next slide, sometimes we get into these challenge questions. So instead of multi-factor authentication, we'll have, challenge questions to answer. I think we need to be careful here. And the reason why is social media has a lot of information about us and who we are. And so if you were ever to look up my pet's name or where I went to high school or whatever my favorite movie is, you would be able to find it in social media, on the internet. And what I'm suggesting here for any challenge questions that you may have is that you put in a phrase that is not that does not connect up with the question. So I put here blue jumping jacks. Chances are I don't have a pet name that's blue jumping jacks, or a high school or a movie. And so my point is create, answers to challenge questions that have some depth, breadth, meaning to you, but no meaning on social media. So let's talk about risks as it relates. Oh, we got a poll question. Sorry.
So now we'll move on to our second poll question. Who did it?
The poll question's open now. How has your organization implemented a teleworking policy? And we'll leave it open for a few seconds here. Thanks, everyone. Back to Jeff here.
So now let's talk about, risks. And I guess that poll question alluded to the fact that I think one of the risks we need to be thinking about is establishing good standard policy, documented policies for our teleworkers at home. How and who's going to be using the technology tools, how we're going to implement, appropriate security standards, and how we're going to implement ongoing communications. I think we need to be providing equipment to our employees to minimize and mitigate the risk, and with that we may need to provide some monitors and such, but it should be the organization, the independent schools equipment. As I mentioned earlier, we can provide secure equipment that has already been configured, and we don't have to worry about the home computer, so to speak. And one of the other things to think about is we should probably hold periodic in-person face-to-face interactions. Is it a risk that we don't see someone? Maybe yes, maybe no, but I think it's it's a good practice, and I know it's a practice that we've implemented at Bloom, just to kind of check in with people and make sure that things are going relatively well. On the next slide, you'll see that there are other employee related risks, and how and things to be thinking about with our teleworkers. The child care and having to manage remote learning at home, distractions, difficulties in plugging. I think that these are some risks to our employees, and burnout and things along those lines. So again, I think these are challenges and risks that we need to think about and consider, and how they get introduced or added to our employee risk management environment is important to think about, and certainly important to consider. So with that, I want to turn it over to Christine Demena, who is going to get more and give us more information on the enterprise risk management and reimagining what it might look like in our new world, in our new COVID world. Thanks, Christine.
Thanks, Jeff. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So a traditional enterprise risk management methodology may look something like this, broken out into phases, starting with phase 1, which is governance, culture, strategy, and objective setting. So this phase would include documenting and understanding the operating structure to oversee the ERM process and reviewing any existing ERM documentation. This phase would also include determining the personnel across the organization to interview and communication of the process and goals of the ERM initiative. Phase 2, which is risk identification and prioritization. During this phase, the selected participants would be interviewed to solicit their views of risk to the organization. The data collected during these interviews would be accumulated and ranked according to likelihood and impact. And typical outputs in this phase would include a heat map and a risk register. Phase 3, risk mitigation and testing. In this phase, the appropriate risk responses are developed based on cost benefit, risk appetite, risk severity, and business context. An organization could either accept the risk and take no action, avoid the risk, or pursue the risk and develop and/or formally document risk mitigation strategies that could eventually be tested. And then phase 4, risk would then be monitored, tested, updated, and tracked on a periodic basis. Go to the next slide. So how do we reimagine enterprise risk management? The purpose of risk management is to identify how to respond rapidly to evolving risks. And as the year 2020 has taught us, acute risks typically can evade forecasting. The traditional ERM approach that is set up more as a periodic risk review may not allow organizations to respond nimbly or appropriately to unforeseen risks and events. So we need to be able to identify evolving risks and relate them to other areas of risk as well. Organizations should really challenge the current process and facilitate regular risk discussions to monitor for emerging threats and opportunities. And this will allow an organization to react quickly and mitigate evolving risks on an ongoing basis. So we need to put systems in place to enable that rapid response to various complex situations and emerging risks. You can go to the next slide. So there are lots of risks that were either low or absent on existing risk registers that have now catapulted to the forefront, particularly for educational institutions. Community is essential to the culture of an independent school. So how can a school recreate the individualized attention and daily activities in a distance learning environment? As social events, field trips, and athletics continue to evolve in the new environment, either by going digital or being eliminated, schools will need to figure out how to keep both faculty and students engaged and connected. Keeping students engaged with virtual or distance learning has proven to be a challenge. And I can say that firsthand, having 2 kids home today doing school. Most independent schools felt somewhat equipped to provide remote learning. However, younger students in particular are harder to keep engaged remotely for prolonged periods, and they may require more parent support and supervision. The mental health of both faculty and students is also a rising concern as we tire of quarantine and the lack of in-person interactions with both peers and friends. And in addition to keeping students engaged virtually, virtual classrooms expose the school to increased cyber concerns, so think of the recent Zoom bombing, as well as a host of issues related to internet access and availability and equipment malfunctions. The other type of risk with virtual classrooms is behavioral. There are learners who may not be present during the actual session or just mentally checked out. So planning ahead and communicating with students about specific technology concerns and classroom expectations is critical. As COVID cases continue to grow, some faculty have chosen to retire early. Others are unable to teach in person due to health issues. And even substitute teachers are very hard to come by right now. So schools will need to develop strategies to retain the current teachers, as well as continue to recruit the best talent, which really is critical to the success and reputation of an independent school. So whether in person or remote, the current school year has brought a host of privacy concerns as well. So how should a school legally and safely share or store student videos or classroom sessions? Sensitive health information may also be collected, such as temperature checks and contact tracing as new cases emerge. So schools will potentially want to avoid recording classroom discussions and also create guidelines for storing those videos. The next slide, please. So uncertainty surrounding enrollment has never been higher. The economic crisis has strained the finances of many families, but in contrast, some have chosen to enroll their children in independent schools for the first time due to concerns with the public school distance learning programs. The quality of an independent school education, as well as the steps being taken to protect the health of both students and staff, may lead to increased enrollment for some. So budgeting for the enrollment has never been harder with all of this uncertainty. COVID-19 has disrupted the traditional school year, and there have been many concerns and inquiries regarding tuition refunds and also increased asks for financial aid. So schools may want to review their contracts and ensure they are clear with respect to refunds. Scenarios such as hybrid, in-person, or full remote, or even potential closure of boarding facilities could also be specifically addressed. In addition, schools should develop standard responses to be prepared to respond to parent inquiries when expectations are different than reality. Visa, travel, and quarantine restrictions have also impacted the international populations. International populations may have decreased or been moved to full remote for the current semester. So strategies to keep the pipeline open for international students and also retain the current students should be reviewed or developed. Compliance with new health and safety standards has been an enormous and unanticipated effort as well. The additional cost to implement the standards and keep the school population safe has had significant financial costs and time restraints. With the sudden switch to remote work, key processes and controls may have changed. So schools have to be able to ensure employees are prepared to perform key duties remotely. Changes to processes should be documented, tracked, and reviewed to ensure a proper control structure remains in place. Lack of cross-training can also impact a school's ability to do business if employees are ill or unable to work. Many processes in the past may have been very paper dependent, think accounts payable. So what has changed or needs to change to automate this? Changes in these procedures need to be evaluated to ensure that controls are still adequate, documented, and being enforced to avoid a breakdown in controls, which could increase opportunities for fraud or error. Next slide. Oh. So it looks like
we'll do a poll question, a third poll question.
Interesting, as the results come in of everybody that's voted so far, about 50% are unsure about the last time this has been performed. So this is pretty key element here to consider going forward.
Great, going to go ahead and close the poll now. So thank you for everyone who's participating.
So we think enterprise risk management in the future will look a lot different than the traditional ERM strategy that we discussed earlier. And there are a few things that we think will emerge. One is the use of scenario analysis, and that can be used to make strategic decisions by defining questions and creating scenarios to address different possible outcomes. And even if none of the future scenarios ever occur, I think organizations could still benefit from the contingency plans that they would have developed for these various scenarios. So I think that's a tool that will see increased use in the future. A sophisticated risk management approach will help capture the full spectrum of risks and help identify trends and evolving risks. So I also expect to see a rise in specialized ERM software and integrated dashboarding solutions that would be able to provide instant insights into an organization's risk across all areas. So this would really be more of an, help automate the process and allow for real-time mitigation of risks as they emerge. An ERM will really need to be embedded at all levels. And this means routinely evaluating risk, and it's really critical to protecting the interests of all involved. ERM is everyone's job and should be part of the daily routine, not a periodic exercise. So I think going forward, the days of having a periodic risk review that you dust off the shelf every few months or once a year is really not going to be the best strategy to make sure that your organization can respond quickly and identify these emerging risks as they occur. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to John, I believe.
Great. Thank you both, Christine and Jeff. There's some great stuff, a lot to consider, and I can't echo Christine's comments there in closing about the routineness of an ERM process at any level, really. I think over the course of my career, especially over the last several years, I've seen that evolve to become a regular agenda item at the audit or finance committee meetings, where really it holds everyone to task to continue to address those risks and evaluate new ones and keep it rotating. So critically important. And I think, just to kind of circle back on those polling questions, I think the vast majority of our folks are working back on campus. I think maybe 0 to 25%. 40% of us said that about a quarter of our workforce is working remotely. So obviously that'll depend on what our plans are as an institution. But for those of us that have been working remotely, about 68% of respondents said they've implemented a teleworking policy. So that's really great. A couple of questions have come in, and I'll try to triage these as best I can. I think this one probably would be up Jeff's alley. Jeff, what, if anything, can we do to protect ourselves from ransomware?
I would say that the biggest and most important thing is to really train employees to stop, think, and then react. A lot of the ransomware is coming in because of two different situations. One situation is there's a link embedded in an email that someone inadvertently clicks, or someone gives out or inadvertently gives out their credentials information. We've seen a lot of it with Office 365. Not that there's anything wrong with Office 365, but if you're going to implement Office 365, implement it with MFA, multi-factor authentication, and that will significantly raise the security posture of that environment for you. The goal here is, if credentials get out, that's how the attackers can get in. They can download that small piece of software to someone's computer, and then, all hell breaks loose. So that's what I would do.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Christine, if we wanted to start down the path and create an ERM initiative, how do we do that?
So I think a successful ERM initiative really has to have support from the top. So support from your board, support from management, and they really have to be the champions of the process. And I would start by really trying to define your goals. What do you want to get out of the exercise? Get support if you need it, and educate all of your employees on what the initiative is and what value it will provide, because I think it's important. Once you have support from the top, you really want buy-in from all of your employees, and you want them to be thinking about risk in their day-to-day, activities as well. And if it seems too daunting to do a full ERM initiative off the bat, make it manageable. Start small. Start, with something that you think you can handle, and work your way up from there.
Great. We in our profession, we hear a lot about, and we know a lot about COSO and those initiatives. How does that? Can you give the audience a little bit of a brief overview and how that might potentially impact ERM?
Sure. So COSO, there's an ERM framework that's one of 2 widely accepted risk management standards that organizations use when implementing an ERM initiative. And, it focuses on strategic objectives, but also really places more emphasis on culture and dives deeper into concepts such as risk appetite. So, the COSO model is one that we use or recommend, using, and it really runs through, a variety of organizational questions and aspects to look at when implementing an ERM framework.
Great. I know there's a lot to that, so we can certainly hold a whole other session on the COSO framework for sure. Looks like the last question I have here, unless anyone comes up with any more. Jeff, what's the most important thing to do to patch employees?
I'm going to go back to training. Our employees can be the most valuable asset that we have to maintain security. Many, organizations, many, independent private schools have, a great group of internal IT folks that are helping to manage and put appropriate security measures in place into the overall infrastructure and the like. And so, to be honest with you, that's the least of my concerns. It's really our employees and getting them to really understand the implications of security and how they can truly help advance and help create a more secure environment. And so the patching of the employees is really ongoing training. Doing training once a year is not worth the effort. You need to do it every other month, I would recommend. And just, it doesn't have to be long sessions, but it needs to be there so that they're thinking about security and the implications and impact to the organization as a whole.
Excellent. Thank you both for those insights. Really, and if anybody in the audience has any more questions as they come up, please reach out to Jeff, Christine, myself, or anyone in the Bloom practice group that can help you answer or help you navigate some of those concerns you may have. So I think before we close the day, we just want to provide a little reminder. We have 2 more sessions coming up on Tuesday, October 6th. Both of the next couple of sessions are at the same time, 11 to 12. Navigating HR and Employment Law Challenges, led by Frank Levesque from our HR consulting practice, and Tracy Thomas Boland, an employment law attorney with Morgan, Brown & Joy. And then we're going to wrap up things on October 20th, where I'll team up with Jennifer Hillen from NBOA, and we'll chat a little bit about the state of independent schools. As a reminder, if you do attend all 3 webinars in the series, you you will have a chance to win $1,000 for your school or favorite charity. So please join us for the next 2 sessions as well. Thank you all for sharing your morning with us during this really busy time of year. Please stay safe and healthy, and we look forward to speaking with you soon.